Do you live in Florida, Georgia, or the Carolinas? Do you live along the Gulf Coast from Texas to the Florida Panhandle? Do you have family in the Caribbean or anywhere near the Cabo Verde Islands off the coast of Africa? If the answer is yes, you need to watch this entire video because right now, in the middle of the Atlantic, in the Gulf, and off the coast of Florida, the tropics are waking up and forecasters are watching more than one system at the exact same time. This is not a drill, and this is not old news being recycled. This is happening this week, as of Thursday, August 6th, 2026, and by the time you finish watching this, at least one more piece of this puzzle will already have changed. Here's where things stand right now. The National Hurricane Center's official 7-day outlook, issued Thursday afternoon, says formation is not expected in the North Atlantic, the Caribbean Sea, or the Gulf during the next week. On paper, that sounds like good news. It sounds like the kind of headline that makes people relax, close the tab, and stop paying attention. But here's the problem. That same outlook is a snapshot of a system that is already moving, already organizing in places, and already producing the exact ingredients that turn into named storms within days, not weeks. Meteorologists tracking the tropics in real time are describing a very different picture than the calm one you might assume from a single line in an official bulletin. And that gap between what the official 7-day window says and what is actually forming beneath it is exactly why this needs your attention tonight. Let's start with what has already happened this year, because it matters for everything that comes next. The 2026 Atlantic hurricane season has already produced 2 named storms. Arthur formed in mid-June in the warm waters of the Gulf off the Texas coast and brought record rainfall to parts of Louisiana, along with tornadoes that touched down along the Gulf coastline. Then came Bertha, which also formed in the Gulf, this time south of the Florida Panhandle, before making landfall in St. Bernard Parish, Louisiana. 2 storms, both born in the same warm pool of water that sits off the coast of the southern United States right now, both proving something forecasters have been saying all year. Even in a season predicted to be quieter than normal, the storms that do form can still do real damage. NOAA's own hurricane experts have said it directly. Inland rainfall, not just wind, is the major cause of damage from tropical systems, and Arthur proved that in Louisiana back in June. Now, here is why this year is different, and why it matters for what you're about to hear. NOAA has been forecasting a below-normal Atlantic season in 2026, largely because of a developing El Niño pattern in the Pacific. The updated numbers call for somewhere between 7 and 13 named storms this year, with 2 to 6 becoming hurricanes, and 0 to 2 of those reaching major hurricane strength. Forecasters are giving this season a 75% chance of ending up below normal overall. But here's what most people are missing. A below-normal season does not mean a safe season. It only takes one storm hitting the wrong stretch of coastline to make an entire year unforgettable for the people who live there. This next part matters, because it is the exact same setup that produced one of the most devastating storms in American history. Go back to 1992. That Atlantic season was, by nearly every measure, one of the quietest on record. Meteorologists at the time were not raising alarms about an active year. And then, in late August, a storm formed that would become Hurricane Andrew, a Category 5 hurricane that tore through South Florida with wind gusts over 165 miles per hour, flattened entire neighborhoods in Homestead and Florida City, and caused over $25 billion in damage in 1992 dollars, making it, at the time, the costliest hurricane in U.S. history. Andrew formed during a quiet season. It intensified explosively, and it left a scar on South Florida that is still referenced by emergency planners more than 3 decades later. The lesson from Andrew is not that quiet seasons are dangerous seasons in disguise. The lesson is that quiet seasons can still produce a single catastrophic storm, and nobody knows in advance which storm that will be. That is the exact tension sitting over the Atlantic basin again tonight. So let's talk about what is actually moving right now, because this is where it becomes dangerous to just skim a headline and move on. As of Thursday evening, meteorologists tracking the tropics in real time are watching multiple systems simultaneously. First, there's a tropical disturbance approaching the eastern coast of Florida and pushing up toward the Carolinas heading into the weekend. It is carrying a large plume of tropical moisture that is expected to move up the east coast into early next week. Right now, forecasters are not expecting this particular disturbance to develop into a named system, but that does not mean it is harmless. Tropical moisture without a defined circulation can still produce flash flooding, dangerous surf, and rip currents along beaches from Florida up through the Carolinas, exactly the kind of hazard that catches people off guard because there is no hurricane name attached to make them take it seriously. Now the focus shifts to the deep tropics, out over the open Atlantic, where the real long-range story is unfolding. Forecasters are watching 2 strong tropical waves moving westward at lower latitudes, the kind of waves that, later in the season, become the engines behind major hurricanes. Right now, those waves are fighting against something called the Saharan air layer, a mass of dry, dusty air that sweeps off the African continent and chokes off the moisture and thunderstorm activity that tropical systems need to organize. Think of the Saharan air layer as a wall of dry air, standing directly in the path of anything trying to develop. Some waves punch through it. Many don't, but here's why this matters for the days ahead. Meteorologists are describing this as the start of what's known as Cape Verde season, the stretch of the year, typically beginning in August and running into September and October, when the most dangerous, longest-track hurricanes in Atlantic history have historically been born, systems that spin up off the coast of Africa, near the Cabo Verde Islands, and track thousands of miles across open ocean before ever threatening land. One more thing you need to know. There's a massive tropical wave expected to emerge off the coast of Africa within the next day, moving into the eastern Atlantic and beginning the same journey that, in past seasons, has produced some of the most destructive hurricanes on record. Forecasters tracking these systems are now putting the odds at roughly 50% that at least one of these waves organizes into a tropical storm within the next 2 weeks, with a smaller but real chance, somewhere around 10%, that one becomes a major hurricane in that same window. That is a significant jump from what had been, until recently, a quiet stretch in the deep tropics. And if you're wondering why the 7-day official outlook says formation isn't expected, while independent forecasters are already talking about a 50% chance of a named storm within 2 weeks, the answer is simple. The official outlook is a snapshot of the next 7 days specifically, while the waves now emerging off Africa need more time than that to travel, organize, and potentially strengthen into something with a name. The clock on that process has already started. Think about what 50% actually means in this context. It is not a small number. A coin flip's worth of odds that within the next 14 days, one of these waves currently crossing open water becomes the season's third named storm. And remember, this year's list of names is already down to Arthur and Bertha. The next name on the list is Cristobal, and after that, Dolly. If one of these systems organizes, it will carry one of those names into forecast graphics, into emergency alerts, and potentially into evacuation orders somewhere along a coastline that, right now, has no idea it might be in the path. That is the unsettling part of tropical forecasting at this stage. The odds are real, the ingredients are real, but the destination is still completely unknown. This next part matters because of how fast these systems can move once they get going. A tropical wave crossing the Atlantic near the latitude of the Cabo Verde Islands typically travels somewhere between 10 and 15 miles per hour, westward or west-northwestward, day after day, for a week or more, before it reaches waters close enough to the Caribbean or the U.S. coastline to matter for landfall forecasting. At that pace, a wave emerging off Africa tomorrow could be approaching the eastern Caribbean by the middle of next week, and depending on the steering pattern in the upper atmosphere, anywhere from the Lesser Antilles to Bermuda to the open North Atlantic could end up in its eventual path. Nobody can tell you today which of those it will be. That uncertainty is exactly why forecasters watch these systems continuously, rather than issuing one forecast and walking away. But that is not the real story tonight, because the Atlantic isn't the only basin being watched right now. Over in the eastern Pacific, forecasters are also tracking a broad area of low pressure that could form off the coast of Central America by early next week. That system is expected to drift generally westward, and while its odds of rapid development are currently low, near zero in the next 2 days, the 7-day outlook puts its formation chances at around 30%. If that system organizes, it would move into the same waters that feed storms toward Mexico's Pacific coast, and, in some seasons, into the Central Pacific toward Hawaii. So while most eyes are on the Atlantic and the Gulf, there's a second front developing on the opposite side of the country, and both deserve to be on your radar this week. But that is not the real story either, because a 30% chance in the eastern Pacific is not something to dismiss just because it's lower than the numbers coming out of the Atlantic. The eastern Pacific basin, running along the coast of Mexico and Central America, actually produces more named storms in a typical year than the Atlantic does. It just gets far less attention because most of those storms track out to sea, away from major population centers rather than making landfall, but not always. Coastal communities in states like Guerrero, Oaxaca, and Sinaloa in Mexico have been hit hard in past seasons by storms that spun up from exactly this kind of broad, disorganized area of low pressure drifting westward off Central America. If this system organizes over the next week, as the current 30% chance suggests it might, the areas most likely to feel the first effects are along that Mexican Pacific coastline. And if it survives long enough moving west, it could eventually approach the waters closer to Hawaii and the Central Pacific Basin, a track that has produced serious impacts on the islands in past years, even from storms that started as nothing more than a broad, sloppy area of low pressure with a 30% chance attached to it. Here is why this is serious for the people actually living in these zones. If you are anywhere along the Florida coastline this weekend, from Jacksonville down through Miami and up into the Carolinas, The message is simple. Even without a named storm, expect heavy rain, expect the possibility of localized flash flooding on roads that flood easily during any tropical moisture surge, and expect dangerous rip currents at the beach, the kind that pull swimmers away from shore before lifeguards can react. Families along that stretch of coast have learned, storm after storm, that the systems without names are sometimes the ones that catch people off guard. Because there's no cone of uncertainty on the news, no countdown clock, just rain that keeps falling on saturated ground until roads become rivers and low-lying neighborhoods start taking on water. And for people out on the water, in the shipping lanes, or on islands like the Cape Verde chain off the coast of Senegal and Mauritania, the wave now moving off Africa deserves real attention. Historically, this is the exact region and the exact time of year when storms have organized quickly and then intensified explosively once they reach warmer water further west. It's the same basic setup that has produced monster hurricanes in past seasons, storms that started as a modest tropical wave near Cabo Verde and grew, over the following week, into powerful long-track systems capable of reaching Category 4 or Category 5 strength before ever threatening the Caribbean or the U.S. mainland. Nobody is saying that is guaranteed to happen with the wave now emerging. But the ingredients, warm water, a wave organizing off the African coast, and the calendar turning into peak Cape Verde season, are the same ingredients meteorologists watch every single year around this time. This is where the human side of this story matters most, because behind every one of these forecast percentages are real people making real decisions this week. Families along the Gulf Coast who are still cleaning up, in some cases, from Arthur and Bertha earlier this summer are now being told to watch the tropics again, just weeks later. Farmers across the southeast, already dealing with the unpredictable rainfall patterns of an El Niño-influenced summer, are watching soil moisture levels that could tip from drought stress to flash flood risk within days if one of these systems tracks over their fields. Coastal communities that depend on tourism during the peak of summer are watching beach forecasts that could shift from sunny skies to dangerous surf warnings by the weekend. And emergency managers up and down the eastern seaboard from Florida to the Carolinas are running through the same checklist they run every time a disturbance starts pushing tropical moisture up the coast. Check the storm drains, check the low-lying roads, make sure the alert systems are ready, because it doesn't take a named hurricane to put water in someone's living room. Power outages are another piece of this that people underestimate. Even a disorganized tropical disturbance, the kind currently forecast to move up the southeast coast without developing into a named storm, can produce thunderstorm clusters strong enough to snap tree limbs onto power lines, especially in areas where ground is already saturated from a wet summer. That is how tens of thousands of households can lose power from a system that never even gets a name, and it's exactly the kind of event that fades from the news cycle almost as fast as it happens, even though the people without air conditioning in the middle of a southern August heat wave don't get to forget about it so quickly. Think about what that actually looks like on the ground. A family in a coastal neighborhood in the Carolinas goes to bed Friday night with a forecast that mentions nothing more than scattered showers. By Saturday morning, a training band of thunderstorms embedded in that same plume of tropical moisture riding up the coast has parked itself over a single county for 6 or 8 hours straight, dumping rainfall totals that a normal summer storm would never come close to. Storm drains that handle an ordinary downpour without issue suddenly can't keep up. A road that floods only in the worst weather starts taking on water by mid-morning. None of this required a named storm. None of it showed up on a hurricane tracking map. It happened because a disorganized tropical disturbance carried enough raw moisture to overwhelm a drainage system built for an average summer, not a tropical one. This is the exact scenario meteorologists are flagging for Florida up through the Carolinas this weekend. And it is precisely the kind of event that catches people off guard because there's no cone of uncertainty, no advisory number, nothing but rain that won't stop. Most people are missing this next part too. The reason meteorologists keep emphasizing that this season is forecast to be below normal is not to reassure you. It's a statistical statement about the total number of storms expected across the entire 6-month season, from June through the end of November. It says nothing about where any individual storm will go, how strong it will get, or when in the season it will happen. Some of the most devastating storms in Atlantic history have occurred during seasons that were overall unremarkable by the numbers. Hurricane Andrew in 1992 is the clearest example. But it is far from the only one. The number of storms a season produces and the amount of damage a single storm can cause are two completely different measurements, and conflating them is one of the most common and most dangerous mistakes people make when they hear a seasonal forecast and decide it means they can relax. Now let's talk about the mechanics of what's actually happening in the atmosphere right now, translated into plain language because the technical details matter for understanding why forecasters are suddenly paying closer attention. A tropical wave is essentially a ripple of low pressure that moves through the atmosphere, often originating over the African continent before pushing out over the Atlantic Ocean. On its own, a tropical wave is just disorganized clouds and thunderstorms. What turns it into a tropical depression, and eventually a tropical storm or hurricane, is a combination of warm ocean water, typically needing to be around 80 degrees Fahrenheit or warmer to a significant depth, low wind shear, meaning the winds at different altitudes aren't tearing the developing storm apart, and enough moisture in the surrounding atmosphere to sustain the thunderstorm activity at the core of the system. Right now, across the main development region of the Atlantic, that stretch of ocean between Africa and the Caribbean, where the most powerful hurricanes typically form, sea surface temperatures are running warm enough to support development. The complicating factor is the Saharan air layer, that dry, dusty air mass that can suppress or even kill off a developing wave before it has a chance to organize. This is the tug of war playing out in the Atlantic right now. Warm water and organizing waves pulling toward development, dry Saharan air pushing back against it. Which side wins determines whether the next several days bring a named storm or just another wave that fizzles out over open water. But here is where it becomes dangerous again, because even a wave that seems to be losing that tug of war can suddenly find more favorable conditions further west, closer to the Caribbean or the Bahamas, and rapidly organize with very little warning. This is exactly what forecasters mean when they talk about a low single-digit chance of development over the next 48 hours, jumping to a 50% or higher chance over the following week. The atmosphere over the tropical Atlantic in August isn't a fixed environment. It shifts day by day, sometimes hour by hour, as waves move through different pockets of moisture, different wind shear environments, and different sea surface temperatures. That is precisely why the official 7-day outlook can say formation isn't expected in the immediate future. While, at the same time, longer-range models and experienced tropical forecasters are already flagging a real chance of multiple named storms forming within the next 2 weeks. One more thing you need to know before we get to what happens next. The window we are entering right now, mid-August through October, is not just any window on the hurricane calendar, it is statistically the most active stretch of the entire Atlantic hurricane season. The vast majority of major hurricanes in recorded history, storms reaching Category 3 strength or higher, have formed during this exact period. That's not a coincidence. It's the point in the year when ocean heat content across the tropical Atlantic reaches its peak, when the atmosphere is primed with the least resistance to storm development, and when the Cape Verde wave train, the conveyor belt of tropical disturbances rolling off the African coast every few days, is running at its most active. Every year, meteorologists brace for this stretch, specifically because history shows it produces the storms people remember for decades. This is where the focus shifts back to the here and now, because none of this is abstract anymore. As of Thursday night, there's a tropical wave expected to emerge off the African coast. There are 2 strong waves already moving west through the main development region, fighting through dry air. There is a plume of tropical moisture already pushing up the southeast U. Coastline toward the Carolinas, and there is a separate system developing in the eastern Pacific off Central America. 4 separate areas of the atmosphere across 2 ocean basins, all being watched by forecasters at the exact same time. That is not typical for early to mid-August. That is the kind of setup that historically has preceded active stretches where multiple storms form within the same 1 to 2 week window. There's a historical thread worth pulling on here too, because it explains why forecasters treat the Cabo Verde wave train with this level of respect every single August. Some of the most infamous hurricanes in Atlantic history trace their origins to this exact patch of ocean and this exact time of year. Storms that began as an unremarkable tropical wave a few hundred miles off the coast of Senegal, barely worth a mention in a daily tropical outlook, went on to become historic hurricanes that reshaped entire coastlines, and in the worst cases, cost thousands of lives before modern satellite tracking and forecasting existed to give people days of advance warning. The reason we don't see disasters on that scale from Cabo Verde storms as often today isn't because the storms themselves have gotten weaker. It's because the forecasting has gotten dramatically better. Because satellites now watch these waves from the moment they leave the African coast. And because agencies like the National Hurricane Center can now give coastal communities a week or more of lead time instead of the day or 2 that was standard a century ago. That lead time only works, though, if people actually use it, which is exactly why meteorologists are raising the flag on these waves now, days before any of them has organized into anything with a name. And here is why that matters if you live anywhere near a coastline right now. This is not the moment to panic, and it is not the moment to assume the worst about any single storm, because right now, nothing has a name, nothing has a confirmed track, and nothing has been declared a threat to any specific city. But this is the moment to pay attention, because the ingredients for the next several weeks of this hurricane season are assembling in real time, right as you're watching this. If you live along the Gulf Coast, from Texas through the Florida Panhandle, an area that has already absorbed 2 storms this season, this is the time to check your emergency supplies. Not because the storm is confirmed, but because the region that has already produced Arthur and Bertha this year is sitting in the same warm water that could produce a third. If you live along the southeast coast from Florida up through the Carolinas, keep an eye on rainfall totals this weekend because flash flooding doesn't need a hurricane name to put your street underwater. And if you have family or connections anywhere near the Cabo Verde Islands or along shipping routes in the central Atlantic, this is the exact time of year and the exact type of setup that historically turns a modest tropical wave into a long-track hurricane over the following 1 to 2 weeks. Now the focus shifts to what forecasters will be watching most closely over the next several days. The wave expected to emerge off Africa will be tracked hour by hour as it moves into the eastern Atlantic, with meteorologists watching for signs of a closed circulation, the point at which a disorganized cluster of thunderstorms officially becomes a tropical depression. The two waves already crossing the main development region will be watched to see whether they can punch through the Saharan air layer, or whether the dry air wins and starves them of the moisture they need. The disturbance moving up the southeast coast will be watched for flash flood potential, even without formal development. And the Pacific system, off Central America, will be watched to see whether that 30% chance climbs as it approaches more favorable waters early next week. Emergency management agencies along the southeast coast are already treating this week as a checkpoint rather than a crisis. That distinction matters. A checkpoint means reviewing supply kits, confirming that battery reserves and portable chargers work, making sure prescriptions are refilled, and knowing which evacuation zone a home falls into, all without a single named storm on the map yet. It is the same guidance issued every year around this point in the calendar, but it carries extra weight in a season that has already produced 2 Gulf storms and is now watching 4 separate disturbances at once. For coastal business owners, this is also the point in the year when insurance paperwork gets pulled out of drawers and reviewed, when marinas start talking about haul-out schedules, and when hotels along the coast start watching cancellation patterns, just in case a system further out starts trending toward their stretch of shoreline. None of that is panic. It's preparation, and it's happening quietly this week in coastal communities from Texas to the Carolinas, even without a hurricane name to justify it on the evening news. This is the part where, on a lot of channels, you'd get a tidy summary and a reassuring wrap-up. That is not where this stands tonight. The truth is that the Atlantic Basin and the Eastern Pacific alongside it are entering the most volatile and most closely watched stretch of the entire hurricane season. At the exact moment, multiple systems are active simultaneously. 2 storms have already formed this year, both born in Gulf waters that remain warm tonight. A season forecast to be below normal has already proven, through Arthur and Bertha, that even a quiet year on paper can still bring flooding rainfall and landfalling storms to real communities. And now, as the calendar turns deeper into August, into the exact stretch of the year when history's most destructive hurricanes have formed, 4 separate disturbances are being tracked across 2 ocean basins at the same time. The wave coming off Africa tomorrow could fizzle in the Saharan dust the way so many waves before it have. Or it could be the one that survives, that finds the warm water and the low wind shear it needs, and that spends the next week and a half organizing into something with a name, something meteorologists and emergency managers will be tracking around the clock. Nobody can tell you tonight which outcome is coming. What we do know is that the setup right now, warm water across the main development region, the start of Cape Verde season, multiple waves in motion, and a disturbance already pushing moisture up the southeast coast, is exactly the kind of pattern that has, in past years, turned into the most dangerous stretch of an entire hurricane season within a matter of days. The next several days will decide a lot. The system, and the ones behind it, are still evolving tonight, and if you live anywhere along the Gulf, the southeast coast, or near the paths these waves have historically taken, this is not the moment to stop paying attention.